On the morning Princess Elara was supposed to marry a powerful prince, a commoner named Tomas was dragged before the crowd and sentenced to death for treason. The evidence against him seemed perfect until Elara noticed one detail proving he had been framed. She abandoned her wedding, stopped the execution, and demanded the truth. By sunset, the princess was stripped of her title and charged with treason against her own father. But what Elara discovered next would reveal that Tomas was only the first piece of a conspiracy hidden inside the royal palace, and the real traitor was closer to the crown than anyone imagined. The kingdom of Valadorn had never seen a wedding like the one prepared for Princess Elara. For 3 years, the royal court had spoken of the marriage as if it were a treaty written in gold. Elara was the only daughter of King Aldric, ruler of Valadorn, and Prince Adrian of neighboring Edivine was the eldest son of the most powerful royal family beyond the eastern mountains. Their marriage would unite two kingdoms that had spent generations competing over borders, trade roads, and military influence. Every noble family had prepared gifts. Every merchant in the capital had decorated their shops. Every church bell had been polished for the ceremony. By sunrise, thousands of people filled the streets around the royal palace, waiting to see the princess leave for the cathedral. But while the capital celebrated, a very different scene was taking place in the old royal square. There, a young commoner named Tomas Vale was being dragged toward a wooden platform by 6 royal guards. Tomas was 26 years old and worked as a courier for the royal archives. He had never belonged to a noble family. He owned no land, carried no title, and had never sat at the king's table. Yet that morning, he was accused of stealing the royal treasury seal, entering the king's private chambers, and delivering secret military documents to an enemy kingdom. The evidence against him appeared overwhelming. The treasury seal had been discovered inside his rented room. A royal document bearing his handwriting had been found beneath his bed. 2 guards claimed they had seen him leaving the restricted wing of the palace during the night. Worst of all, a servant had testified that Tomas had received a large payment from a foreign merchant 3 days before the crime. King Aldric had therefore ordered the execution to take place before noon, believing that the traitor should be punished before the wedding ceremony began. Elara knew nothing about the execution at first. She was inside the eastern tower, surrounded by attendants preparing her wedding dress. Her gown was made of white silk embroidered with silver flowers. Her crown rested on a velvet cushion. Her hair had been arranged for almost an hour. Everything around her represented the future that the royal court had planned. Yet Elara had never felt less like a princess. She had spent the previous night unable to sleep. She had known Prince Adrian since childhood, and she respected him. But she had never chosen this marriage for herself. Her father had told her that a princess did not marry for love. She married for peace. Elara had accepted that duty because she believed her sacrifice could protect thousands of people. Then a young palace messenger entered her chamber carrying a small sealed report. The messenger was pale and frightened. He placed the report in front of Elara and explained that it contained the final evidence against Tomas Vale. Elara opened it because she had always been curious about royal cases, especially those involving common people. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then she noticed a single detail. The military document supposedly written by Tomas contained a date written according to the old royal calendar. Tomas had never studied that calendar. More importantly, the document used a formal abbreviation that had been abandoned 20 years earlier. Only senior members of the royal administration still knew it. Elara remembered seeing the same abbreviation in her father's private records. She immediately understood that the evidence could not have been written by Tomas. The report had been constructed to look convincing to people who did not know the old system. Elara asked for the original document, but the messenger told her it had already been sent to the execution square. That was the moment everything changed. The princess looked at her wedding dress, then at the palace gates beyond the window. The ceremony was less than an hour away. If she left now, she would embarrass the royal family before every visiting noble. If she stayed, a man might die for a crime he had not committed. Elara made her decision without asking permission. She removed the wedding veil, ordered her attendants to stay inside, and walked out of the chamber still wearing the unfinished dress. The guards tried to stop her from leaving through the ceremonial entrance, but Elara reminded them that she was the king's daughter. No one expected her to ride into the royal square. No one expected her to arrive before the execution, and no one expected her first order to be the command to stop everything. When Elara reached the square, the executioner had already raised his weapon. Tomas stood bound beneath the grey morning sky. The crowd fell silent when they saw the princess. She stepped from her carriage, lifted one hand, and ordered the guards to release the prisoner. The captain refused. He explained that the king himself had ordered the execution and that no princess could interfere with a royal judgment. Elara then demanded to see the military document. The captain gave it to her reluctantly. She examined it in front of the entire square and pointed to the old abbreviation. She explained that Tomas could not have written it. The crowd began to murmur. The captain ordered the guards to seize Elara instead. She did not resist. She simply looked toward the palace, knowing that her father would soon hear what she had done. Before the princess could say anything else, royal soldiers surrounded the square. The king had already issued a second order. Princess Elara was to be taken back to the palace immediately, and if she continued interfering with the judgment, she was to be treated as an enemy of the crown. Elara had stopped the execution, but she had also crossed a line that no royal daughter had crossed before. Her wedding guests were waiting at the cathedral. Prince Adrian was waiting at the altar. The foreign delegation had already witnessed the chaos, yet Elara no longer cared about the ceremony. She knew that an innocent man's life was connected to a secret inside the palace. What she did not know was that the person who had created the false evidence was watching her from a high window above the square. And that person had been waiting years for the princess to make exactly this choice. By noon, the royal wedding had become a political disaster. Prince Adrian remained inside the cathedral while foreign ambassadors whispered among themselves. The king's ministers attempted to explain that Princess Elara had suffered an emotional crisis and would soon return to the ceremony. But everyone in the capital had already heard the truth. The princess had abandoned her wedding to protect a commoner accused of treason. King Aldrich considered the act a humiliation. For him, the issue was no longer simply Tomas Vale. His daughter had publicly challenged a royal judgment in front of thousands of citizens and foreign nobles. If the king allowed such behavior without punishment, every noble family would believe that royal authority could be questioned. Elara was therefore brought before the royal council that afternoon. Tomas was kept under guard in another chamber, still technically a prisoner. The council chamber was filled with dukes, counts, military commanders, and senior ministers. Elara entered without her veil, her wedding dress still covered in dust from the square. She looked exhausted, but she did not look frightened. The king sat at the head of the chamber. His face showed disappointment rather than anger, which somehow made the moment worse. He demanded that Elara explain why she had interfered. She refused to apologize. Instead, she presented the document and explained why the writing could not belong to Tomas. Several council members examined the paper. Most remained silent. One elderly minister named Lord Varick immediately declared that the princess was mistaken. He insisted that the abbreviation was common knowledge among palace scribes. Elara knew that was false. She had spent years studying Roy. And had seen the old records herself. But before she could prove it, another accusation was placed before the council. The royal treasury seal had disappeared from its chamber on the same night Tomas had supposedly entered the restricted wing. The seal had been found in Tomas's room. The council therefore argued that the forged document did not matter because the physical evidence remained. Elara asked who had searched Tomas's room. The answer was Captain Rowan, commander of the palace guard. Elara then asked who had first discovered the seal. The answer was the same. That connection disturbed her. She remembered that Captain Rowan had served the royal family for 20 years. He had been one of her father's most trusted officers. Yet she also remembered something else. The captain had been outside the treasury chamber during the night of the alleged theft. If he had been guarding the corridor, how had the thief entered without being noticed? Before Elara could continue, Lord Varick accused her of creating confusion to protect her personal reputation. He claimed that the princess had fallen in love with the commoner and had abandoned a royal alliance for a personal desire. The accusation was absurd, but it spread quickly through the council. King Aldrich demanded that Elara deny it. She refused to waste time on the rumor. She insisted that Tomas must be given a proper investigation. The king then made a decision that shocked even his closest advisors. He ordered Tomas to remain imprisoned and placed Elara under royal restriction until the matter was resolved. Prince Adrian was informed that the wedding would be postponed indefinitely. Edivaine's delegation threatened to leave the capital. The kingdom's enemies immediately began watching the border. Everything Elara had feared about the political consequences of stopping the execution was now happening. Yet she believed the truth was still within reach. That night, while the palace slept, Elara secretly studied old royal documents. She searched for examples of the abbreviation found on the forged military order. After several hours, she discovered that it had appeared in only one type of document: confidential orders issued by the king's military council. The abbreviation was not simply old, it was a code. It indicated that the person who wrote the document had access to restricted military information. Tomas, a common courier, could never have possessed that access. Elara realized that the conspiracy reached much higher into the palace than she had imagined. She also discovered that the original document had been copied from an older military plan. The copied map showed a hidden mountain road leading toward Edivain. That road had been closed for 15 years. Someone had recently reopened it. Elara's investigation was interrupted by a noise outside her chamber. She found a small wooden box left beneath her window. Inside was a single old key and a piece of parchment containing only a symbol. Elara recognized the symbol immediately. It belonged to the Royal Archive's forbidden collection. She had seen it once before in records concerning the death of her mother, Queen Seraphine. The queen had died when Elara was 7 years old. The official story claimed that she had become sick during a winter journey. Elara had never questioned it, but now the symbol had appeared beside evidence connected to a supposed traitor. She realized that Tomas's case might be connected to a secret buried for almost 20 years. She secretly contacted the archivist who had once taught her about the forbidden collection. The old archivist warned her that the collection contained records the king had ordered sealed. He told her that anyone who opened them without permission could be charged with treason. Elara decided to open them anyway. Before midnight, she used the key to enter a hidden archive beneath the palace chapel. There she found records concerning Queen Seraphine's final months. The documents revealed that the queen had been investigating financial transfers between several noble families and the royal treasury. She had suspected that someone was secretly using royal funds to finance an army outside the kingdom. Then, 3 weeks before her death, Seraphine had written one final report. The report was missing from the archive. Only its cover remained. On the back, however, was a sentence written in faded ink. It warned that if anything happened to the queen, the person who knew the truth would be someone who had never been allowed to speak before the king. Elara immediately thought of Tomas. The common courier had delivered documents throughout the palace for years. He had seen countless things but had never been considered important enough to question. Someone had chosen him precisely because no one would believe him. And now Elara understood the true danger. Tomas had not been framed because he was guilty. He had been framed because he had accidentally carried something the conspirators desperately wanted to recover. Before Elara could search further, footsteps approached the hidden archive. She extinguished her candle and waited in darkness. 2 men entered. One was Captain Rowan. The other was Lord Varick. Their presence confirmed what Elara had feared. The conspiracy was inside the royal council. But then she heard something even more disturbing. They were not talking about Tomas. They were talking about the king. Elara remained hidden behind the stone shelves, while Captain Rowan and Lord Varick examined the sealed archive. Their voices were low, but the princess could hear enough to understand that they were preparing something much larger than the destruction of Tomas. They believed the king had become suspicious. They feared that the old financial records would eventually reveal the truth. Their plan was therefore to create a political crisis between Valadon and Edevan, forcing King Aldrich to depend on the military council. Once the crisis began, they intended to control the kingdom through the army. Elara realized that the wedding had never been the real objective. The wedding was simply the perfect moment to create chaos. A public accusation against a commoner, followed by a princess abandoning her marriage to defend him, would divide the royal family and damage the alliance with Edevan. If the alliance collapsed, the military council could claim that the kingdom needed stronger leadership. Elara suddenly understood why the conspirators had framed Tomas so carefully. They had needed someone innocent enough to become a symbol of royal injustice. Tomas was that person. The princess herself had unknowingly become the next piece of their plan. When Rowan and Varick finally left the archive, Elara waited until the footsteps disappeared. She searched the shelves again and found an old ledger hidden behind a damaged book. The ledger contained payments made from the royal treasury to several military officers over a period of 16 years. The names included Captain Rowan and members of Varric's family. But one name shocked Elara more than the others. It was the name of a former royal advisor who had died shortly after Queen Seraphine. His record showed that he had transferred enormous sums of money to a private army near the northern border. Elara began to understand the missing piece. Her mother had discovered that certain nobles were preparing a military takeover. She had tried to expose them. Her death had stopped the investigation. The conspiracy had survived for nearly 2 decades. Tomas had recently delivered an old package from the royal archive to a noble estate. He had not known what it contained. But the conspirators believed he had seen something that could expose them. They had therefore created the perfect accusation. Elara returned to her chamber before dawn. She needed evidence that could not be destroyed by the council. She also needed Tomas alive. Yet by morning the king announced that the commoner would be interrogated again. Elara went directly to the prison and found Tomas exhausted but conscious. Since the story had to be understood without relying on character dialogue, the truth was revealed through actions and records rather than spoken explanations. Tomas had kept a small cloth pouch around his neck. Inside was a broken piece of wax bearing the royal seal. He had found it several days before his arrest in the archive corridor. He had planned to give it to the royal archivist, but before he could do so, he had been arrested. Elara recognized the wax. It was not the current royal seal. It belonged to the seal used by Queen Seraphine. That discovery changed everything. Tomas had unknowingly carried the last physical clue left by the dead queen. Elara realized that someone had tried to recover it by framing him. She took the wax to the archivist, who confirmed that the pattern matched the old royal seal. He then revealed that Queen Seraphine had used a private seal for confidential messages. That seal was believed to have disappeared after her death. The princess now possessed part of it. She returned to the archive and searched for a matching impression. After hours of work, she found a sealed letter hidden inside an old book. The wax impression matched the broken piece perfectly. The letter had never been opened. Elara used the piece Tomas had found to identify it as genuine. Inside was a report written by her mother. The report revealed that Seraphine had discovered a secret military treasury controlled by several nobles. She had planned to present the evidence to King Aldrich, but before she could, she became ill and died. The final lines of the report contained one devastating warning. Seraphine believed that someone close to the king was helping the conspirators. She did not name the person because she feared the letter would be intercepted. Instead, she described a sign, a black hawk engraved beneath a silver crown. Elara had seen that symbol before. It appeared on Captain Rowan's private sword. She immediately understood that Rowan was involved, but she still could not prove that he had killed her mother. She needed stronger evidence. Meanwhile, Prince Adrian had decided to leave Valadorn with his delegation. The alliance was collapsing. The king was losing control of the court. Nobles were choosing sides. Some supported Elara, believing she had acted honorably. Others accused her of destroying the kingdom's future. Lord Varric used the chaos to convince the council that Elara's actions had endangered national security. He presented a new charge. The princess had intentionally disrupted a diplomatic wedding to weaken the king's authority. Under royal law, that could be considered treason. King Aldric hesitated. He loved his daughter, but he also believed the kingdom could not survive if royal authority disappeared. Lord Varric pressed him to act. By sunset, Elara was officially charged with treason. Her title was suspended. Her royal guards were removed. She was placed under arrest inside the palace. The announcement spread through the capital. Citizens who had watched her stop Tomas's execution now wondered whether she had truly betrayed the kingdom. Elara accepted the charge without resistance because she knew something the council did not know. The evidence in her possession could destroy the conspiracy, but she also knew that evidence would be useless if she could not prove that the king himself had been deceived. That night, she examined the letter from her mother again. There was a strange mark at the bottom, almost invisible beneath the wax. It looked like a small crown divided into 3 parts. Elara remembered seeing the same symbol carved into the foundation of the old royal chapel. She understood that her mother's final secret was not contained in the letter. The letter was only a key. The real evidence was hidden somewhere beneath the palace. And if the conspirators discovered that Elara had found the key, they would do everything possible to stop her before she could uncover it. The trial of Princess Elara began 3 days after her arrest. It was held inside the Great Hall rather than the usual court because the accused was a member of the royal family. Nobles filled the balconies. Foreign representatives watched from behind guarded doors. The citizens of Valadorn gathered outside the palace, waiting to hear whether their princess would be declared a traitor. King Aldric presided over the proceedings, but he looked older than he had only weeks before. The pressure of the political crisis had changed him. He had lost the confidence of several ministers. His alliance with Edivine was collapsing, and now his own daughter stood accused before him. Lord Varric presented the case against Elara. He claimed that she had abandoned a royal wedding without authorization, publicly challenged the king's judgment, released a suspected traitor, interfered with the military investigation, and endangered the diplomatic relationship with Edivine. Each accusation was supported by witnesses and official documents. The evidence appeared convincing because it described events that had truly happened. Elara had abandoned the wedding. She had stopped the execution. She had challenged the king. She had caused a diplomatic crisis. What the court did not know was why she had done those things. Her defense rested entirely on proving that Tomas had been framed. The court examined the military document again. Elara presented the old calendar system and demonstrated that the document could not have been written by Tomas. Lord Varric responded by claiming that someone might have taught Tomas the system. Then Captain Rowan presented a second piece of evidence. He claimed that Tomas had been seen near the treasury on the night of the theft. The witness was an elderly palace servant who had worked there for decades. Elara recognized him. He had served her mother. She studied his expression and noticed that he looked terrified. He did not look like a man who wanted to accuse Tomas. He looked like someone who had been threatened. Elara then requested access to the servant's employment records. The request was denied. The court ruled that the records were unrelated to the case. Elara understood that the conspirators controlled the trial. She therefore stopped trying to win through ordinary legal arguments. Instead, she used the one thing the conspirators could not predict: the truth about her mother's hidden evidence. Elara asked the king to open the old royal chapel. Lord Varick objected immediately. He argued that the chapel had no connection to the charges, but Elara explained that the symbol from her mother's letter was carved into its foundation. The king agreed to inspect it personally. The court moved to the chapel. Beneath the stone floor, they found an old chamber sealed for years. Inside was a small iron chest. The chest contained military maps, financial records, and several letters bearing the signatures of nobles who were officially dead. The records showed that a secret military force had been funded through the royal treasury for almost 20 years. The money had been used to purchase weapons and influence commanders. The ultimate goal had been to replace the king with a council controlled by the conspirators. Queen Seraphine had discovered the plan. She had tried to stop it. Her death had allowed the conspirators to continue. The evidence finally explained why Tomas had been chosen. He had delivered one of the last hidden records without knowing its importance. Someone had seen him carrying it. They needed to remove him before the document could reach the king. The royal court was stunned. Captain Rowan attempted to destroy the records, but several guards stopped him. Lord Varick tried to flee through the chapel entrance, but Prince Adrian appeared with a group of Edivane guards. He had not left the kingdom after all. Instead, he had remained nearby because he had begun investigating the conspiracy independently. The alliance that seemed broken had never completely disappeared. Adrian had discovered that several Edivane officials had also been bribed by the conspirators. He had returned to protect the truth rather than the wedding. The revelation changed the political situation immediately. Captain Rowan was arrested. Lord Varick was placed under guard. Other nobles named in the records were detained. Tomas was released from prison. Yet Elara's treason charge did not disappear automatically. The king still had to decide whether his daughter had technically violated royal law. The great hall became silent when King Aldrich returned to his throne. He looked at the evidence from the chapel, then at his daughter. For years, he had believed that protecting the crown meant protecting the image of the monarchy. Now he understood that the crown could only survive if the truth mattered more than appearances. He declared Tomas innocent of every charge. He ordered an investigation into Queen Seraphine's death. He also admitted publicly that the royal court had failed to protect an innocent citizen. Finally, he turned to Elara. Under the law, her actions could still be classified as treason because she had openly disobeyed a royal order. But the king chose not to punish her. Instead, he declared that her actions had protected the kingdom from a greater betrayal. Her title was restored. The treason charge was withdrawn. The citizens outside the palace erupted in celebration, but Elara did not celebrate immediately. She knew that the most painful truth remained. Her mother had not died from an ordinary illness. She had been fighting a conspiracy that had reached the heart of the royal government. The king had to live with the knowledge that people he trusted had betrayed him. Elara had to live with the knowledge that she had nearly lost her family while trying to protect a stranger. Tomas returned to his work in the archives, but he was no longer treated as an invisible commoner. His courage and innocence became known throughout Valadorn. Prince Adrian remained in the capital, and the wedding question was left unanswered. Elara had abandoned the wedding because she believed justice mattered more than ceremony. Now she faced a different decision. The kingdom expected her to repair the alliance. But Elara had learned that a royal marriage could not be built on duty alone. She needed to know whether the future she accepted would truly be hers. The next morning, however, another discovery changed everything. While reviewing the documents found beneath the chapel, Elara found a final page hidden inside the iron chest. It had been written by her mother only days before her death. The page contained no accusation and no political warning. It contained a message about Elara herself. Seraphine had written that if her daughter ever discovered the truth, she should not spend her life seeking revenge. She should build a kingdom where a person's birth did not decide whether their life mattered. Elara understood that the entire conspiracy had begun because powerful people believed common citizens were too insignificant to challenge them. Her decision to save Tomas had therefore done more than protect one innocent man. It had broken the system that had protected the conspirators for years. But the final secret on the page was still unread. A small note at the bottom directed Elara to a place outside the kingdom. It mentioned a village that had not appeared on any royal map for decades. The mystery was not completely over. The village named in Queen Seraphine's final note was called Belmere. Official royal maps showed nothing in that region except a forest and an abandoned military road. Yet Tomas had once traveled near that area as a courier. He remembered seeing an old stone bridge beyond the forest. Elara decided to investigate because the note suggested that someone had survived the conspiracy and might know the full truth about her mother's death. The king wanted to send soldiers with her, but Elara refused a large escort. She did not want the villagers to fear another royal investigation. Tomas volunteered to guide her because he knew the old roads. Their journey lasted 2 days. When they finally reached Belmere, they discovered a small community hidden between the hills. The villagers recognized the royal crest immediately, but they did not welcome it. They remembered the soldiers who had come years earlier, searching for Queen Seraphine's missing records. The villagers had protected the queen's secret by pretending not to know anything. An elderly woman eventually led Elara to an abandoned mill. Inside, hidden beneath the wooden floor, was a narrow chamber containing several old letters. The letters revealed the final part of the story. Queen Seraphine had discovered that the conspirators planned to assassinate King Aldrich and blame the attack on Edivane. If successful, the 2 kingdoms would go to war. The royal wedding between Elara and Adrian had been designed partly as a peace treaty, but the conspirators intended to destroy it at the last moment. The false accusation against Tomas had been only the opening move. Once Elara abandoned the wedding, they planned to accuse her of treason, collapse the alliance, and use the resulting panic to seize military control. The princess realized how close the kingdom had come to disaster. The conspiracy had been waiting patiently for years. They had studied every weakness of the royal family. They knew the king valued duty. They knew Elara valued justice. They knew Prince Adrian valued peace. They had created a situation where every honorable choice could be turned against them. The only thing they had not predicted was that Elara would discover the old calendar code. That tiny detail had broken their plan. The villagers also revealed something unexpected. Queen Seraphine had not traveled to Belmere alone during her final weeks. She had been accompanied by a young palace guard who helped her escape the conspirators. The guard had later disappeared. His name was Garin Vale. Tomas recognized the surname. Garin was his father. Tomas had grown up believing his father had died while serving as a royal soldier. In reality, Garin had helped Queen Seraphine hide the evidence and had spent years protecting the secret from those who wanted it destroyed. He had died shortly after sending the final evidence toward the royal capital. Tomas had unknowingly continued his father's work without knowing it. This explained why the conspirators had chosen him. They had discovered his family connection and feared that he might eventually uncover the truth. Elara now understood that Tomas's innocence had never been an accident. He had been targeted because his existence connected the past to the present. When Elara returned to Valadorn, the truth about Queen Seraphine was finally revealed to the public. King Aldrich ordered a formal memorial for his wife and publicly admitted that her investigation had saved the kingdom from war. The conspirators were brought to trial. Some nobles lost their titles and property. Others were imprisoned. Captain Rowan confessed to helping falsify the evidence against Tomas. Lord Varric was sentenced for treason. The kingdom slowly began to recover. Yet Elara faced one final problem. The marriage treaty with Edivane had been damaged, and Prince Adrian's family wanted assurance that Valadorn would remain stable. The simplest solution was still the wedding, but Elara no longer wanted to marry merely because everyone expected it. Prince Adrian understood. He did not pressure her. Instead, he spent months helping repair the alliance between the two kingdoms. He worked with merchants, soldiers, and diplomats to restore trust. Elara watched him choose peace even when there was no ceremony to reward him. That changed her feelings toward him. Their relationship had begun as a political arrangement, but it slowly became something chosen rather than forced. Meanwhile, Tomas was offered a position in the royal archives. He accepted only after asking that the archive become open to ordinary citizens who wished to study royal records. The king agreed. It was a small change, but it symbolized everything Elara had fought for. Birth would no longer determine who could seek knowledge. The royal treasury was audited. Military finances were made transparent. Citizens gained new legal protections against false accusations. The king also created an independent court for cases involving commoners and nobles, because he had learned that justice could not depend entirely on royal authority. Years later, people would remember the day Elara stopped the execution as the beginning of these reforms. But Elara remembered it differently. She remembered a frightened man standing beneath the gray sky. She remembered how easily everyone had believed the evidence because it was easier to believe a commoner was guilty than to question powerful people. She remembered that her wedding dress had become covered in dust before she even reached the altar. And she remembered the moment she realized that being a princess meant nothing if she was unwilling to protect people who had no power. Her mother had left her that lesson. Tomas had carried it without knowing, and the kingdom had finally learned it. Still, one question remained. Why had Queen Seraphine trusted a common guard instead of the royal council? Elara found the answer in one final letter. Her mother had written that trust should never be measured by title. A crown could hide a traitor, and a common uniform could hide a hero. That sentence became the foundation of Elara's future rule. She no longer wanted to become a queen who simply inherited power. She wanted to become a queen who understood why power existed. And when the time finally came for her to choose a husband, she made the choice herself. 2 years after the day of the abandoned wedding, Valadorn had changed more than anyone expected. The royal court was smaller. The treasury was monitored by independent officials. The military council had been reorganized. Citizens could petition the crown without passing through noble families. The archives were open to the public. The story of Tomas Vale had become famous across the kingdom, not because he had been a hero in battle, but because he had survived a system designed to make him appear guilty. His name was now associated with the first great reform of King Aldric's final years. The king himself changed as well. He became less concerned with ceremony and more interested in the lives of ordinary citizens. He visited villages without announcing his arrival. He inspected roads and markets. He listened to people who had never before spoken directly to the crown. His transformation was partly caused by guilt over Queen Seraphine's death, and partly by his daughter's courage. Elara remained at his side, preparing for the day she would inherit the throne. She had become respected not because she was perfect, but because she had once been willing to lose everything for someone who had no title. Prince Adrian continued visiting Valadorn as an ally rather than a rejected groom. The two kingdoms signed a new treaty based on trade and mutual defense rather than marriage. Their relationship grew naturally. Elara eventually realized that she no longer saw Adrian as the prince she had once been expected to marry. She saw him as the person who had chosen to remain when leaving would have been easier. When Adrian finally asked her to marry him again, he did not do so before a crowd or beneath a royal banner. He asked privately, without political promises and without expecting an answer. Elara accepted because this time the decision belonged entirely to her. The wedding was held months later in the same cathedral where the first ceremony had been planned. But the meaning was completely different. The first wedding had been designed by politicians. The second was chosen by two people who had survived a conspiracy together. Tomas stood among the honored guests. The villagers of Belmere were invited. The elderly woman who had protected Queen Seraphine's letters was given a place near the royal family. No one was excluded because of birth. The ceremony was simple compared with the grand celebration planned years earlier. There were no enormous military displays. There were no political speeches. The kingdom simply celebrated. After the ceremony, Elara walked through the palace gardens and stopped beside the statue of her mother. She placed the broken piece of Queen Seraphine's old seal beneath the statue. It was no longer evidence. It had become a symbol of what had been saved. King Aldric joined her. He told her through his actions rather than grand words that he was proud of the woman she had become. Elara looked toward the capital. The streets were filled with people from every class. Nobles stood beside merchants. Soldiers stood beside farmers. Children watched the royal procession from the same streets where Tomas had once been dragged toward our execution. The kingdom had not become perfect. No kingdom ever could. There would always be ambition, jealousy, mistakes, and people who wanted power. But the difference was that now there were laws designed to prevent power from becoming absolute. The greatest lesson of the conspiracy was not that nobles could be evil or commoners could be innocent. It was that truth did not belong to one social class. Elara remembered the day she had abandoned her wedding. At the time, everyone believed she had thrown away her future. Some called her foolish, some called her selfish, some called her a traitor. She had lost her title for a time. She had lost the wedding that had been planned for years. She had nearly lost her father's trust. She had stood before a court accused of treason. Yet none of those losses had been permanent. The thing she nearly lost was much more important: her ability to choose what kind of ruler she wanted to become. By defending Tomas, she had discovered the weakness inside the palace. By uncovering her mother's secret, she had prevented a war. By refusing to remain silent, she had changed the laws of the kingdom, and by abandoning the first wedding, she had accidentally created the possibility of a second one that was based on choice rather than duty. Years later, when Elara became queen, the royal historians recorded the entire story. They wrote that the kingdom had once stood on the edge of civil war because a princess refused to let an innocent man die. They recorded the names of the conspirators, the hidden treasury, the secret military network, and Queen Seraphine's final investigation. But Elara insisted that the most important part of the story was much simpler. She wanted the historians to record that Tomas Vale had been a commoner, and that his life had mattered before anyone knew his name. That sentence became part of the law of Aledon. Every citizen, regardless of birth, had the right to be heard. The king's authority remained strong, but it was no longer unquestionable. The crown remained powerful, but it was expected to serve the kingdom rather than stand above it. And the princess who had once been charged with treason became the queen who was remembered for making justice stronger than fear. Her story was eventually told to children in schools, to travelers in taverns, and to new royal heirs preparing to inherit the throne. Whenever someone asked why Queen Elara had abandoned her wedding, the answer was always the same. She had done it because an innocent man was about to lose his life. But the deeper truth was something only those who knew the whole story could understand. She had not abandoned her future that morning. She had unknowingly walked away from a future chosen by others so that she could build one of her own. And when she finally returned to the altar years later, she did not arrive as the frightened princess who had once been forced to choose between duty and justice. She arrived as a woman who had already proven what she believed. The kingdom welcomed her. The man she had saved stood among her closest friends. The prince she had once been ordered to marry now stood beside her because they had chosen each other. Her father's crown remained secure. Her mother's truth had finally been honored. And the commoner whose innocence had almost been buried beneath a false accusation became one of the most respected guardians of the royal archives. The conspiracy was over. The wedding was finally celebrated. The kingdom survived, and the princess who had once been called a traitor became the queen who taught an entire kingdom that sometimes the bravest act of loyalty is refusing to obey injustice.